Hello, my name is Xander and welcome. This tutorial is all about introducing you to Django Permissions. So this tutorial may be a kind of mini series of a few tutorials where we focus in on working with Django Permissions or permissions in Django or with Django. And I see this kind of unfolding. This tutorial we're talking about model level permissions, focusing on the admin site. The second tutorial, which I've already planned and have ready, is looking at Django object level permissions. And here is where we're going to start to introduce, if you haven't started using this, Django Guardian. From there, we'll then move over to kind of views, looking at model level permissions with views and basic templates. And then we'll do the same thing with object level permissions. And that will hopefully give us a grounding into the world of Django permissions. From that point, we could then focus on maybe DRF or APIs. And then from there, it will just goes wherever we want, really. And I'll happily take your suggestions. So I have designed this tutorial to be an introduction. So you may already be familiar with Django permissions, general user objects, and how to apply permissions to users and groups. If that isn't your thing, then definitely maybe skip to the next tutorial where we start looking at permissions on an object level. Now, that's essentially what we're going to be exploring in this tutorial. So we're going to explore the Django permission system at a high level, have a look at some of the models that Django provides us by default, understand the basics of, just provide some clarity between authorization and authentication, or the idea of that. And then we go ahead and on a practical aspect, apply permissions to users and groups. And then we'll go ahead and assign admin site model permissions and just explore some of those basic concepts so that we can start to manage access to our data in the Django admin site. So you may already be familiar with authorization, the ability to determine the identity of a user, for example. So that could just be a simple login system and then authenticating that person as a user of your system. Of course, it's not always a user that you're trying to authenticate. Maybe it's some sort of external server or client. So once we've authenticated a user or a server or a client, typically the next step is thinking about permissions, authorization. So I will utilize the word permissions, authorization. Typically, I'm talking about the same thing here, and that's determining what resources a user, a server, or a client can access. So permissions, determining what resources a user can access, is the focus of this tutorial series. So for at least the first couple of tutorials in this series, we will focus on looking at permissions related to database access. But of course, that isn't the only type of permissions we want to create. Further afield, we might be thinking about URL resources or services that are available within our application, and potentially what individual pages a user can access. And that's something that we can potentially explore later on in this series. So because authorization typically occurs after authentication, we need to know a little bit about the general authentication system within Django, if you didn't already know a little bit about it. So the key here is to understand user objects. There is really only one user object in Django. However, they are differentiated into, say, 3 subcategories, if you like, and that's super user, staff, or user. So a user can be a super user, a staff, or user. And really the difference here is that there are special attributes that are set for super user and staff users. And that's really just a Boolean field in the database. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a Django application. I'm assuming that you already know how to create a Django application. We'll do this very quickly. So I've opened up Visual Studio Code, and then I just need to make a virtual environment. So in Windows, it's going to be slightly different. Have a look at the tutorials. Not too long ago, I did provide a tutorial on how to set up a virtual environment. So here in Mac, I'm going to type in Python 3, and I've just forgotten what I need to do. Right, okay. And then we'll go ahead and just activate that in Mac. Like I said, if you're on Windows, there is a tutorial to help you out. So let's go ahead and pip install Django. We'll go ahead and create a new project called core. And then finally just start a new app called inventory. So as we previously mentioned, there are only one class of user which exists by default in Django's authentication framework. However, loosely speaking, we can say there are three types of users by default: super user, staff, and user. And like I said, these users have special attributes that we can set, which will then define whether they are super user, staff, or user. So back in our project, let's go ahead and migrate the initial tables. Now you can see from this that we've migrated the initial tables. And because, if you're not familiar with this, in settings, we have some pre-installed applications. One of them is Auth. That's going to set up all the tables that are going to be needed for the authentication system in Django. So we can drill down further here. Now we've created our database. We're using SQLite here. So with this, I have an extension here called SQLite. If we go back and I just right click and open the database, a new option will appear down here. And I can then drill down and then have a look at the auth user. Let me just bring it up a bit. The auth user, I can show that table. And you can see that there is nothing in there at the moment because we haven't created any users. So just looking at the drop down, that will then give us the view where we can see the fields inside of this table. And you can see one of them is super user, and that's a Boolean. And the other here is staff. So this is how we're going to differentiate the user, because all users are going to be stored in this table. This is how we're going to associate the user to either a super user, a staff user, or just a normal user. So a normal user would not have super user or staff Boolean set to true. Okay, so one other point to mention is that in order to log into the admin, we are going to need to ensure that the user is staff. So typically we would set the is super user also to staff. So back in the command prompt, let's go ahead and actually create some users. So I'm going to go into the shell here and then create a new user. So I'm going to need access to the user table. Now that exists, of course. So that basically imports the user table here. Now you notice that we don't, so that imports the user table. So next up, we're going to create an admin. So let's go create a variable u here. And then we're just going to use create user to actually create a new user. And that's going to be the username admin. And then the password is going to be admin. Okay, so once that's done, what we're going to need to do is set some privileges. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is set the super user to true. So we're storing this object then in u. So we're just going to fire that off. And then we'll say is super user true. And then we do the same thing for is staff. And then we go ahead and save. So u.save. So that should add a new record in our database. So if we show the table, let's do a refresh and show the table again. You can now see we have a new user. That is an admin user, and is staff is active, have all been set, and also is super user is also been set. So we'll do the same thing then for the staff user, but this time, of course, we're only going to set staff to true. So that's going to allow by default the staff user to access the Django admin site. And then we'll go ahead and we'll just save that. So let's just finish this up by creating a normal user. So I'm just going to call this user a password of user. And then we're not going to give this any privileges. So we just need to save this. So now going back into our database here, you can see we have 3 new users and they all have different privileges. We have the admin with is staff and is super user, staff with just is staff, and the user does not have the is super user or is staff flag active. So in terms of users, with the out-of-the-box experience with Django, that's pretty much the setup that we have, or the types of users, if you like, that we have now to think about applying permissions to in Django. So let's go ahead now and have a look at permissions and authorization. So a little bit out of scope, but I wanted to point you towards some theory or some things to think about if you are developing an application and implementing authorization. Take a look at role-based access controls and attribute-based access controls. Essentially, what this is 2 types of approaches for developing and applying authorization. Just to kind of give you a snapshot of the 2 approaches here. If you were thinking about developing a small application for a small or medium-sized organization, maybe you would take the approach of role-based access controls. It would be probably a little bit more simpler to configure and set up and to manage. However, if you're thinking about a much kind of larger scale application where you're looking for more dynamicness and granularity, then you'd probably go towards the approach of attribute-based access control. There's just loads of information online if you wanted to look a little bit further and maybe give you kind of a grounding before you start thinking about implementing or developing your authorization approach. So in addition to the authentication system, Django also has an authentication system. Now, that's all built in. This built-in permission system or authorization system really is designed for the Django admin site initially, and therefore applies or allows you to, like we'll see shortly, allows you to apply permissions to manage access to the database models. So by default, anytime we create a new model, Django will create 4 default permissions. So if we were to create a model, a new model, which we're going to do, and then migrate that, Django will automatically create 4 default permissions, which will move into the database. And that will be to add, change, delete, and view that model. So that's managed automatically and created for each and every Django model that we migrate. So if we navigate back into our database, we can see that we've got a few different tables here, and one of them is Auth Permissions. So you can see we've got 4 fields here, content type, code name, and name. So this pretty much manages the different permissions that have been set up. So if we show this table here, we can see that there are already some, even though we haven't migrated any new tables, we still have around about 24 different permissions that have already been set. Now notice here what this permission is. This is literally just a name and a code name. So these are 2 things that are utilized potentially in your code. So the code name allows you to identify the permission. Typically you would use that name to identify the permission. And the name just allows you to add some additional information so we can describe and identify the purpose of that particular permission. So that's pretty much all permissions are in Django. And we can create our own custom permissions, and that's probably a separate tutorial that we need to cover. And what will happen, those permissions will be set up here, potentially, unless we create some sort of bespoke permission table. And that's pretty much all you get. So the idea is that these permissions are set up, and then we need to apply, when we create our own permissions, we would need to create our own code, which will then correspond to this permission. So take, for example, maybe we made a permission called access homepage. And then obviously this permission that we can assign to some users allows them to access the homepage or not. So the idea is that we set up this permission called access homepage, and then we apply it to a user that we want to access the homepage, and then they can go ahead and access the homepage. And of course, we would need to set up that piece of code which would check to see what permissions the user has before they access the homepage. And then if they did, or if they were assigned this permission, if the user was assigned this permission called access homepage, then they could access the homepage. And if they weren't, then they obviously couldn't access the homepage. And that's kind of a general overview of how we might want to set up a permission. So these permissions here have already been set, and these kind of the baked in permissions, if you like, into Django. They pretty much make sense. Add session, change session, view group, add user, change user, delete user. So it's quite self-explanatory by looking at them, what potentially these permissions are going to be connected to. So notice here then, apart from the auth permissions and the auth user, so the user and the permission table, we also have these other tables here called user permission and auth group permissions. And the reason why that is because in the auth table here, there are two many-to-many tables. Sorry, many-to-many fields. It looks a little bit like this. So we have the auth user table, and it has a many-many relationship to the auth group or the groups table. So a user, one user could be part of many groups, and one group, there could be many users. So there's a many-to-many relationship here, and that's why we have the auth user groups, so that users can be in multiple groups. So in addition to that, we also have a many-to-many table or connection relationship to the auth permissions table. So a user could be connected to multiple permissions, and one permission, well, there could be many users connected to that permission. So we have a many-to-many relationship. So therefore, we have this link table between the auth user and permissions, and also auth user and auth group. So that's where these two tables come from. And we also, I think, have a many-to-many connection between the auth group, the group and the permissions, because what we're going to find is that we can add permissions to individual users also. And normally a better way of working when we're trying to manage multiple users is to add them to a group and then apply permissions to that particular group. So it's well worth drilling down to this level, because eventually, no doubt, I'll create a tutorial where we will extend the permissions table and I'll create our own permissions table. And there's many reasons why you might, the benefits of doing that in your application. And we get to see that when we move over to that tutorial. So by default then, if we were to just navigate through these other tables, there is literally nothing in these tables at the moment. All that's happened is that Django, when we migrated initially, it's created the auth table. It's then created all the associated tables, or the many relationship link tables. And we also have the group table. So that's pretty much all you get by default. And you can see, like we've just seen there, Django automatically sets up initial permissions so that we can start working in the admin site. So let's go ahead now and run the server so we can access the admin site. So having already created 3 users, we should now be able to access the admin site. But the key here is to understand who can access the admin site to begin with. So by default, super users can pretty much access everything. So as a super user, if you have been flagged as a super user, remember, all a super user is a same type of user object as everything else, but we've seen those attributes that are set in the database. So a super user can log in by default to the admin site. So the staff user can also log in. We'll see that too, but they don't have access to any of the initial tables like the super user does, and the user cannot access the admin site. So the only way a general user can access the admin site if we set their permission in the database. Remember, in the user model, the attribute, sorry, if we set that to is staff. So you probably don't need a demonstration, but we'll just go ahead and just quickly show you this because it's really simple. So user, we tried to log in and it tells us we can't log in. The staff will be able to, so staff, that's the staff. So we can just see the behavior there. So as soon as you've logged in, you can see that we don't have any permission, okay, to view or edit any of the existing models. And there should be 2 models here, because the 2 models that we should see is going to be the user table and also the group table. So those are the 2 models that we should have by default set up and ready to configure. So if we just log out and just log back in as the admin, which is just admin and admin, then you can see that we now have access to groups and users. So let's remember that behind the scenes, the only reason why we do have that is because the admin is defined or set by default to some of these permissions. So for example, delete group, add group. And in addition to that, they can view, where are we? So by default, we've got can view permissions. So we've got view, delete, change, and add. So they would have access to these permissions here on those 2 models that you can see in the admin. So let's just take a look at some of the default features here. So we have the user model. From here, we can go ahead and add and remove. If we go into some of the users, it does provide us the ability to set permissions. So we've got permissions here. this option. So we can assign, this is just a basic user. We could assign them to staff. We could also assign them to super user status. Now, if you look further down here, we have groups and we have user permissions. So let's just focus on assigning permissions to users rather than groups. It's the same type of procedure. So you can see here we have a list of permissions. So this will match the list of permissions that is currently in the permissions model. So that should match up nicely there. So for example, if I wanted to give this user access to a model, notice here on the left-hand side, or essentially here, what we have is a naming scheme. That makes it a lot easier for you to identify the permission that you're trying to set. So let's just go back into the user here and go to staff. Now, remember, staff can access the admin system, the admin site, but they cannot access any of the models. So simply put, if we were to, for example, find the model that we wanted to add a permission to, or add the user permission to. So that's going to be auth, and then it's users. Okay, so users, we want them to be able to add a new user. So we're going to need to allow them to view a user. And then let's go ahead and let's just go for view user. Right, so we've allowed this user, which is the staff user, now to actually view users. So we're going to go ahead and just save that. And let's go back and log out, and let's log in now as staff and see the behavior change. Okay, so now we can see that we can actually access, we're told that we can view, we can access user, and we should be able to then drill down. Notice that there are no options available here for me to edit or change. We can simply just view users. Needless to say, we have to be careful here. And eventually, you'll want to change permissions in such a way that you get to a point where you need to complete some customization. And we'll go through a few examples of how we might want to customize that shortly. But let's just go back into this and have a look where customization might be needed, for example. So let's just log back in as admin. So take, for example, we wanted the staff user to be able to maybe change aspects of other users. Maybe they are allowed to change the username, or they're allowed to change a small aspect that might need to be changed, or to set a new password, for example, in the system. So that's something that we might want to allow other users to be able to perform other than a super user, because it's probably pretty dangerous having too many super users in your system, because it means that they can access everything. So again, you might take the approach of removing all the access from everyone, and then just starting again and applying permissions in that manner. So let's just go back to the user staff again. So take, for example, here, we wanted them to view the user, and we also wanted them to be able to change. So we're going to go auth user can change user. So we add that into, and then let's go back and save. And then we just log out again and just have a look at this behavior. So this time you can see the pencil icon, and now says change, so we can view and change potentially. So that gives us some indication of what we have. So the problem with it we've got here is that maybe we only wanted them to be able to change a certain aspect. And of course, by assigning that permission, it's much broader than we would probably hope for, because now, for example, they could set their own status to them. For example, they could change themselves as super users. And of course, that's not a behavior that we probably want to have, or we probably don't want other users to be able to perform that type of change. So you will probably find very quickly that there is customization that needs to be done almost instantly. And yes, you can see that Django does provide quite a lot of features straight off, but within a few moments, you'll be asking yourself some much bigger, deeper questions potentially, and want to make some changes. So let's take a look at how we can potentially start to control and manage this. So just going back into the project here, I'm going to just set up the new app that I created earlier called Inventory. And we'll create a new model, and we'll go ahead and migrate, and we'll work on this model. Okay, so all the code is in the description of this video. I won't go through line by line here. I'm just going to paste in and create a new model here. I'll just quickly talk over it if you're not familiar with Django models, but you can see this is just a simple product table. Web ID, it's got a slug and name. It's almost irrelevant. Description, created up, created at, created, updated at, and then I just don't need that. Let's get rid of that for now. And then we've got a name here. So like I said, the code is in the link. You'll find that in the video description if you want to copy that out. Otherwise, just pause there and you can just quickly type that out. So we're going to go ahead and migrate that. So I'll make migrations. And then we'll go ahead and just migrate that. Okay, so as soon as we've migrated that, we now have some more permissions for this particular model. So let's just go ahead and run this server again. And we'll just go back into our, we'll log out of that. We'll go log in back in as the admin so that we can see this. And then we go back into wherever users and staff here. And we can now see, if we move down, we have the inventory. That's the app name, the product, that's the model name, and then this is the privilege or the permission, sorry. So can add product, can change product, can delete, and can view. So by default, there are 4 permissions that have been set on this new model: add, change, delete, and view. So we just have to remember that by default, only admin members can see that by default. We would have to, for the staff member, actually allow them these privileges. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we'll add it so that they can then go ahead and have full access to this inventory table. So let's now think about a more granular control, given more defined control over this model. So what we're going to need to do here then is go into the admin. So here we're going to register the model so that we can actually access and view the model in admin. So this is going to be, let's go ahead and import that. So import, from models, let's import product. And then we'll just go ahead and register this. So admin.site and then .register. And that was product. So going back here in the admin, let's just log back in as staff. And then we can see the products. Yep, everything is okay. And we can do just about everything because we have all the privileges. So let's just grab and create a new product. What do we call this? Product 1. Okay, so at the moment, this user can access all these fields. Like we saw in users, they will have certain privileges, permissions. So what if you wanted to take an approach where users can only access some of these fields in this form? For that, we're going to need to create a class. So we're going to use the admin.register product, and then we'll go ahead and create a new class so that we can fine-tune these permissions. So this is going to be the product admin, and then we're going to grab admin.model admin. Okay, right, so let's just go ahead and just list display equals, we're just going to display the name. So what's important here to understand is that this is just simply a form. So we need to basically check the user type to begin with, whether the user is admin or not. If the user is admin, they should have all full privileges to change whatever they want here. But if it's just a user, we're just going to allow the user to, oh, sorry, not the user, the staff user. We're just going to allow the staff member, the staff user, to be able to change, for example, the name, or just maybe update the description. So what we're going to need to do here then is bring in the, or override get form, thank you. And then we're going to need to override this, and then we're going to set the form to disable the different components in the form that we don't want the user to be able to access. So let's go ahead and do that. So we've got a request and then object, and then we're going to need maybe just to find the quarks. Okay, so let's just bring this over. Form. So form equals super dot get form. Yeah, get form, and then let's say request object quarks. Okay, so what we want to do then is to check whether the user is a super user or not. So let's say is super user equals, and we can, from the request, we can determine who actually made the request. So the request data essentially is the user making a request to access that resource, that page. So we can grab information from within that, and then we can determine what type of user they are. So we can say request and then access the user, and then we can check to see if they are super user. So is super user, what's happening here then is that essentially in the database, in the user table, we have a field called is super user, and that's a Boolean. So that's going to return true or false. So if this user is a super user, then the Boolean in that field will be true, and therefore we return true. So now we've determined what type of user is trying to access the resource. We can now go ahead and make some changes to the form. So let's go ahead and say super user. So if they're not a super user, then what we're going to do is we're going to grab this form, and then we're going to take the base fields. I always spell fields wrong. It doesn't matter how many times I do it. And then, now we need to determine what fields we want to disable. So let's just disable, for example, let's just do the name. Right, so this is the name. So that's going to correspond to the name field in this form. And so that's basically now going to grab that, and we're now going to disable it equals true. So this is kind of a crude way, if you like, of utilizing type permissions, if you like, in Django. In this case, it's not essentially using permissions at this point, is it? But we've differentiated the user object utilizing the attributes in the table. So this is allowing us to determine what type of user is currently making that request, so that then we can then perform some actions. And obviously we can do this also is staff as well. So remember, we have the separate attribute in the table is staff, so we can filter further with that. So let's go ahead and now just return the form. Now we've made some changes, and yeah, that's pretty much all that we need to do at this point. So this works instantly. So let's go back into here. Now we are logged in as staff, so we are going to need to if I just refresh, you can see that there is a problem. Okay, so just looking back at this, I've forgotten the second starter. So change that. Let's go back and refresh. And this time you can now see that this field has been grayed out, suggesting that we can no longer edit this field. Not massively exciting, but that starts a narrative, I think, into thinking about customizing and utilizing the user object, and now thinking about, well, how can we then granularize permissions somewhat. So let's move into the idea of how to maybe override some of the permissions directly. So here we saw that we have users. There are different, which I described as types: super user, staff, and user. And we've utilized that or leveraged that idea to then apply permissions, but then pull back some of or customize some of that behavior so that we can further customize what it is we want users to be able to access and the types of activities or actions we want them to perform. So let's just quickly remind ourselves A user will enter this page, make a request to access this page. Now, this user happens to be the staff user, and we've given them the 4 permissions that are created when we create a new model, and we created this products model. So those 4 permissions, remember, were add, change, delete, and view the model. So we can say that on making a request to this page, Django will check the permissions to ensure that the user has permissions to actually be able to perform certain actions maybe on this page. So the first one was view. So view allowed us to interact with the products in the first place. Now, second to that, potentially edit. So if we were to remove or add edit, that will then give us permissions to potentially save. So if we removed edit, probably what would happen was the save button would remove. Now we had the delete permission as well. So again, this delete button would be removed if the user didn't have delete permission within this in this view here. So let's take a look at the permissions table and view and check to see what permissions the user has. So from permission, we can just go ahead and create a filter, and the username is staff. And you can see that returns then all the permissions. So likely what's happening then, like we're saying, behind the scenes, a number of tests are being performed. Potentially that then applied on the template in this case. So for example, for this delete button to actually appear, the user must have delete permission. So that would be checked behind the scenes before this delete button would appear. And then similar again with the save button, potentially if we have access to, for example, edit, then depending on whether that returns back to Django as true or false, being that the user is part of that or has that permission or not, remember it's going to be a Boolean true or false, then that would depend on whether the save button appears. So we have 4 default permissions. So let's go ahead and we can access them directly. So here I've just copied and pasted 4 functions here: has add permission, has change permission, has delete permission, has view permissions. So what I've done here is that I've literally just overridden the permission. So I've set the permission in this case to false. Now anyone who now goes to the product or tries to inspect product won't be able to access it because I've changed the permissions manually here: add, change, delete, and view. So let's just go back now here and just refresh, and you can see straight away, well, it's not going to work. So let me just double check this. I don't have the server turned on, so let's just go ahead and run the server. And then once I go ahead and refresh that page, you can see that we no longer have access. And even though I'm logged in as staff, and then you remember we've assigned those permissions to the staff user, you can see now they've been overridden and I no longer have access to the products table. So let's go ahead and change this view to true. And then let's go back here and you'll see that then it appears. So if I go in, I now have access, and you can see that there's an issue here. That's just a bit of a conflict with this code for now. So I'm just going to deactivate that for now. So let's go back. So by default then, utilizing or overriding has view permission, returning true. That now allows or has essentially set the true permission, which allows viewers to actually view the products table. So this is a type of or level of control we might want to turn into some sort of mixin, of course. So let's go ahead and create a read-only admin mixin. We'll just go ahead and we'll move this over here into our new mixin, and then we can just drop this in. We need to be careful with this for the name resolution order. We need to make sure it's at the wrong place at the start here before the admin.model admin. So we've set the view permission to true. So the server should still be on. So we refresh. So let's go ahead and, for example, has changed permission. Let's set that to true. So let's allow users to actually change aspects as well. And there we go. You can see that that instantly then changes the form. By all means, go and have a look at the Django documentation if you haven't already found it. You'll find this in the Django admin site. There's a whole bunch of aspects here. It's well worth reading through. So what can we do with this? So you can see here that we've created a very simple mixin. where we could apply that to separate models to add like a blanket permission for that model. And obviously that is overriding the existing permissions that we're setting on the user, of course. So we saw that in the staff user, we gave them all permissions to begin with. And now we've kind of overridden those permissions. And this is going to give us some more kind of granular control over potentially what these behaviors, these permissions. So thinking about some simplistic type of actions you might want to perform. So for example, the view permission, maybe you set it so that only at a certain time it returns true. Obviously, if this returns false, then they can't access it. So this would just be a simple function whereby you check the time and then you would set the time users could access that, maybe work time, 9 to 5 or something like that. And then obviously that changes as and when they're at work. That's a simple thing that I can think of. Another thing is that, well, let's just show you how potentially you could access the user's permission here. So let's just do it here. So change permission, right? So let's just access the user's permission. So if obviously what we're doing is what Django does at this point, we're just kind of mimicking what Django does, but we can say request user. So request, remember the user makes a request, so we can access their details through the user, through that request. So we can grab the user information. So we can say has perm. So here we're going to check to see if they've got permissions. So the format here is the name of the app, inventory, and then dot, and then the name of the permission. So that's the code name. So let's go back into our database here, and we can see these permissions. Now we've got the content ID. So what's happened here is when we made a new model, you're going to find in the content type, you can see that our model, inventory, has been provided an ID. And this is a really powerful aspect of Django, which I don't see anyone talking about, but not to digress. So we can see that the ID of this product, and that is handy to then identify. If we go back into permissions, we can then identify via the content type ID the permissions that have been set. So we've got add product, change product, delete, and view. So this is the code name, and we're going to need that to then just finish off this here. So we're looking for change product. Okay, so if the user has changed product, and this is where you start to see, well, actual fact, you could make your own permissions and you could set your own functions at this point, or you could start to see how that potentially could be done. So let's say that if they do have the permission, the correct permission, then let's go ahead and return true. Obviously, they should be able to, or else let's just say, well, they can't access. So obviously our staff user does have this permission. Therefore, we return true and they should be able to have changed permission. So let's go back into here and refresh. You can see we have changed permission. So let's just test that out. Let's just say false. And you can see, and that will just check to see if this is actually working. So this user, this staff user does have that permission. So we set it to false now. So because they do have that permission, you can see then it then removes that privilege for them. So we can see that is working. You can see potentially how you might want to potentially utilize that within your application. So I've logged back in now as admin, and you can see that those permissions have now been set for all users, including admin. So this will override also the admin privileges. So that's something that you need to be considerate of potentially if you're creating some custom code, just to consider that, because it might be that you don't want to change the admin privileges, in which case, you just need to set up your code in a way that ensures that that doesn't override for the admin. So a simple if request user equals super user, then return true, else, and so on. Okay, right, so we've been focusing on users. So it's worth noting that, like I said previously, that typically we want to manage our users because we may have multiple users. It's a lot easier to manage our users with groups. So we can apply privileges or permission, to groups. So let's just go ahead and make a new group. We're going to call that group. What we're going to call a group? We're going to call that group staff. So let's go ahead and add a new group. staff. There we go. And then what we want to do is just add some privileges. So with the inventory, they're going to be able to access the inventory. So let's go ahead and do that and press save. All right, so that's the group. So what we can now do, go back into our user, go back to staff. Let's go ahead and just remove these permissions. And let's go ahead and just add the group. So all we've done there is we've just removed the direct permissions for that particular user, and we've applied the user to a group. That group has a set of permissions associated to it, and now exactly the same. We have exactly the same behavior as we did as if we were just to set the individual permissions. So notice now that I've logged back in to the admin with staff here, and you can see that I can access it. So I've gone ahead and changed request user has permission and then true. So there's nothing special I need to do because they're part of a group anymore. They still have that permission, and that has been checked. So it returns true, and they can access this model to change. So if I just change that to false again, just to double check that is working and being applied for that user, yes, it is. So there's nothing necessary we need to change there because we've added them to a group. But groups is a much more effective way of managing multiple users. Users can be part of multiple groups, which is really quite handy. So we can mix and match, but ultimately that can cause issues ultimately. And we obviously need to be careful of that. So it does take some thinking sometimes if you've got a larger project, thinking about what groups you might want to apply, because it can be very easy to accidentally add users to different groups, and you end up giving them too many privileges. So it can be quite common to have many super users, but you still want to restrict their access somewhat. Maybe, for example, you don't want a super user to be able to access users or groups, for example. So if you remember, users and groups are tables that we don't set up. It's something that is defined by Django, and therefore by default the admin or super user can access user and groups by default, and that's not always a behavior that we want to have in our application. So what we need to do here is access the base user admin class. So let's bring that in. So we access this class, and what we want to do from there is, well, first of all, we need to deactivate the two tables. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say admin.site, and instead of register, we want to unregister, unregister, that's going to be user, and then admin.site.unregister the group. So that should have the behavior that should, remove those tables from the default view when a super user logs in. So we just need to import the models. So let's do that from Django.contrib auth models, right? Yeah. Auth models, and let's import user. Okay, so that's that, and then group should be capital. So we need to bring that in as well. So that just grabs the two models, and then we've gone ahead and just unregistered them. So that should now just log in again as the admin. So there we go. So we don't have those models anymore. We still have the products because we've registered that. Let's just go ahead and ignore that. Just comment that out. Okay, so now we can see when the super user logs in, they don't have that default access anymore. So let's go ahead now and create a. Let's go ahead and register this. So for example, user, and then we'll say class custom user admin. Let's bring in user admin. and let's pass. So what's happened here is I basically just unregistered the user and group. Then I've gone ahead and re-registered the user group to the user admin. So I'm in exactly the same position as I started with, however, with the user table. However, I've now got the ability to add some different functionality. So this is essentially a way of creating some overrides and setting out the logic that I want to have associated to this table. So from here, maybe I can then start to change the permissions to allow access to other users, for example, or just granularize some of the control like we saw earlier. Maybe we want to highlight or disable some of the fields. So maybe, for example, I think like we said at the start, maybe we wanted the staff user to access the user table, but we didn't want them to access certain aspects of that form. So this is how we would do that. So we've created this, we've unregistered and re-registered to then have that kind of granular control. So if we go back into here, refresh, we now have the users table. And for the super user, it's exactly the same experience. So let's go ahead and go into the staff here and let's give them a little bit more access. So I wasn't expected that because I thought we changed that. I thought we added the group. It didn't look like it. I don't think I've saved it properly. So let's just remove that. So let's go into the user here. I'm going to need to do a refresh. Oh, apologies. So I've got user already here. That's why. So let's remove that. So user, they can change the user and they can view them. They can't add or delete. So let's go for save there. So let's log out of the admin now. Let's log back in as staff. Okay, so they can access user. We go to staff. So here's the problem, isn't it? So they can change a little bit too much. We don't want them to potentially change all these other aspects. So the idea here is to, like we did previously, we can go ahead and where are we? We can go ahead and just override the form. So let's just bring this code back in. Just drop this down. Okay, so here's the form. So the name, I think there's a name. So it's username. Okay, so let's just, we don't want to give them access to the username. And then there's other things we might want to do. So for example, let's just bring something in here. So we can go into the form, make it so that they can't access the super user. So we've just disabled that, so they can't change that. They can't now change any permissions. And in addition to that, they also now can't assign any permissions or groups. Sorry. So, you can see what's happening there potentially. We're using the name of the form or items in the form to then disable aspects. So if I refresh now, you can see that things are starting to gray out. So it no longer can kind of access permissions here and groups, and you can no longer select super user. So you can start to see how you can potentially make some changes there to that. So there we go. So we've explored the basics there of the Django Permissions System. We now know how to, or we know a little bit more if we didn't already, about the user object, the three different types of users, the attributes that's been set, and how we can utilize that to change the authorization of different aspects of our application. And then we move into the idea of permissions. So we've inspected the permissions model. We hopefully know a little bit more about the model, the setup of the model, the fact that we can apply permissions to users and groups. We know how to do that. And we've spoken a little bit about kind of, or we started to delve into that granular control that no doubt we'll be looking for moving forward here. And really just two aspects we're looking at here. So we looked at form overriding, and in addition to that, then we looked at kind of changing directly the permissions and looking at how potentially we could create mix-ins to bring into our application if we had some similar kind of setups that we needed on different models, and how we can drill down further and provide even more granular control within those. As always, if you have got this far, thank you very much for listening. I do hope it was useful. It's not going to be for everyone, that's for sure. And I do try and add more information than maybe some other tutorials provide. I know it's can be a little bit long-winded, no doubt, and it's not perfect. I don't script these things. I just say it a few times and it gets a little bit better. Sometimes it comes out really well, sometimes it doesn't. I do apologize. But again, hopefully there was some useful information there that you can now start to think about. And really, it's hard at this point to give you any kind of concrete examples because there's so many permutations to what your project might need. And what I've tried to do here is just to give you some of the tools that you can start to utilize to then build up your permission framework. So next up, we are definitely going to be talking more about object level permissions. I'm going to give you a small overview, an introduction to object level permissions. So what we've done now is the permissions that we've kind of set are very much object level. So you can add, delete, remove, delete, add, delete, view, models. But what happens if you want to, if there's specific items in that model that you want to be able to access or not have access to? So that's object level permissions. And we're going to have a look at Django Guardian and how we can start to implement that to get that level of control. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope you, like I said, have found some value here, and I look forward to see you in the next tutorial.